All right, welcome back to the African History Network show. I'm your host, Brother Michael Imhotep. And on the line we have Dr. Leonard Jeffries. Dr. Leonard Jeffries is one of our Grandmaster Scholar Warriors. We've had him on the African History Network show 13 times, if I remember correctly. And he is the former chairman of the Black Studies Department at City. In this segment, we'll talk about the documentary that's airing now every Tuesday on PBS by Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross. We want to welcome back to the African History Network show Dr. Leonard Jeffries. Hotep, brother, how you doing tonight?
Hotep, I'm certainly glad to, as always, to be on your radio family network.
Absolutely, brother. Absolutely. Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I had you on Your Voice with Angelo Henderson on WCHB 1200 AM here in Detroit a couple of weeks ago. And people were talking about that show, brother. That was deep. And, I think this is a very important conversation. I just finished up in the previous segment. I did an interview with a new MPM from Contra Costa in California. And about his new book, Death of the Willie Lynch Speech, Exposing the Myths. And the last question I asked him was about the movie 12 Years a Slave and the seems like a resurgence of slave-themed movies. I read an article back in January of this year that talked about how you're going to have at least 7 slave-themed movies in 2013, 12 Years a Slave. And then we have this Dr. Gates Jr., The Americans. Now, for those who aren't familiar with it or maybe seen bits and pieces of it, it deals with African American history basically from about 1619 for the most part up until today. It's in 6 parts. It airs every Tuesday on PBS, Public Broadcasting System. He has 40 historians that he's consulting with in interviews throughout the 6 parts, and he asked them to significant stories in African American history that they cover in this documentary. So they ended up with 500 stories. So he reduced the 500 stories down to 7 stories, and those are the stories that you see in the 6 parts. Now, the first installment was called the Black Atlantic, okay? And the Black Atlantic explores the truly global experiences that created the African-American people beginning a full century before the first documented slaves arrived at Jamestown, Virginia. The episode portrays the earliest Africans, both slave and free, who arrived on the North American shores. Soon afterwards, the transatlantic slave trade would become empire, connect 3 continents through individuals called like a 10-year-old named Priscilla, who was from Sierra Leone in the mid-18th century. We trace the emergence of plantation slavery in the American South. The late century, a global of freedom movements, and the Black Atlantic examines what the era of revolutions, American, French, and Haitian, would mean for African Americans and for slavery in America. And he goes on to say the Black Atlantic aired October 22nd. If people go to PBS, I think it's pbs.com/mini river, that is the website. They have the show's archived there. So Leonard Jeffries, in episode 1, the Black Atlantic, you and I have talked about this, some of the historical inaccuracies. What were some of the gross historical inaccuracies that you saw in episode 1?
Well, I'm glad you laid the context for us dealing with the brother, and the context in which he chose his history to present. Now, I hope we're not breaking up, as check with your check people to see whether it's going through all right.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, because I thought you were breaking up a little bit when I was talking. But see, you can have a history that deals with episodes, or you can have a history that deals with systemic development. And so my approach is to deal with the system. And when he selects these episodes, it allows him to present his perspective on the history. And he, fortunately, has a history of trying to present the history as we have traditionally received it from our school systems and the history books, and that's his story, the story of rich white men with property and power, and he has a genius of involving the black experience around the white experience, so it becomes a distortion. I'm looking at a book I have in my hand called The Shaping of Black America by Lerone Bennett, and that particular work helped me rewrite how I teach the history, because he's dealing with certain key concepts and systems. For example, the first generation. And he talks about Anthony Johnson.
Yes.
And the first blacks that came with the Dutch man of war in 1619. But he also deals with white servitude. And that's not meaning white folks that came in indentured servitude, who were the first to be placed into that system of control and domination. And then he talks about the road not taken, that America could have developed a fully free society, but they chose to institutionalize and systematize a slave system. So when you look at the Black Atlantic and the dispersal of our peoples from Europe to link up with the African continent to the New World, then you've got to look at the triangular slave trade system to have an idea of how the Black Atlantic was formed. And when you put the slave trade system in place, you can see how Europeans had a four-way profit system that starts in the mind of the European in Europe as he laid out the various joint stock companies, which were the slave trading corporations that came out of Spain and Portugal and England and Holland and Germany and Denmark and Sweden and France and Amsterdam. So if you do not look at, and the first profits were made in fitting out the ships and putting in the guns and the whiskey and other things to cause havoc on the African coast. And then the Europeans set up a whole system of forts and so-called castles on the coast of Africa. And then that becomes the second profit, when wars were induced among Africans to produce captives. And then those same ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean, and on the auction block, Africans were sold. And then from the plantation labor, the profits of the plantation production went back to Europe. So you had a four-way profit system that helped produce the so-called Black Atlantic, but it helped produce the European-American Atlantic as well, and it all was centered around profit-making without any holes barred, and the processes led to the dehumanization of African people. So episodes give you one picture, systems analysis gives you a larger picture, and I prefer to look at it in terms of the system of the transatlantic slave trade system, in which the Europeans fought wars for decades, if not hundreds of years, over who was going to control that system. But our friend Henry Louis Get the Truth Gates wants to put the blame for enslavement on African people. So the Black Atlantic is a place to start, but you have to see how it started and where it started. And one of the first fundamental places, you have to go to Rome and the popes that set up the papal bulls that allowed for the Black Atlantic to be created in the name of God. And so the Catholics initiated this process of African enslavement, and it was continued in the 1500s when the Protestant Reformation was born. And so we need to see the Black Atlantic in relationship to the European-American Atlantic in its fullness.
Exactly. Now what exactly is Atlantic? Explain to us what that actually is.
Say that again. I didn't hear, brother.
Explain to us exactly what the Black Atlantic is.
Well, black people have dispersed. When we had a major world conference in Senegal in 2010, there were 5 or 6 main themes, and one was the origin of humankind coming out of Africa.
Okay.
And another was Africa's contribution to the great civilizing forces. And another was the dispersion, the first dispersion of Africans, that would have been moving around the globe to establish humankind. And the Black Atlantic refers to the period of European exploration, trying to reach out of Europe to other parts of the world, first Africa, and then all the way around to Asia. And the European Black Atlantic refers to the dispersions of black people in North America, the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, which came out of the slave trade system. And you have to put the system component in to be able to understand how and why black people were used as cargo to help the economic development of this emerging European-American world. And so the Black Atlantic cannot be seen in and of itself. It has to be seen as part of the processes that the European put in place to conquer the new lands, devastate the indigenous populations with an unbelievable genocide that went on for hundreds of years. And then in order to exploit the new lands, he tried his own people. They didn't work. The Native Americans did not work. And so Africans were brought into what he's calling the Black Atlantic for the purposes of making the European system of exploitation and plantationism become an economic factor in their future development. So I don't look at it isolated. I look at it as coming out of a context of history, and that context of history is European exploring, trying to get out of, as Dr. John Henry Clark says, his icebox and get into the sun and then get the resources in the lands of the sun in order to make his life more meaningful. And as Dr. Clark says, everybody wants in Africa, but they don't want to pay for it, so they have to come prepared to take it. And that's something Africans have yet to learn, that everybody needs and wants Africa and Africans and African wealth and African history, and they're prepared to take it and fight for it. And we have to be cognizant that there is an intellectual warfare, a cultural warfare, and economic warfare against African peoples, and we have to use our history and our analysis to appreciate that. And unfortunately, Henry Louis Skip the Truth Gates does us a disservice by taking some of the most important parts of that history, but not putting it into a systemic context, and so we can understand the concepts, the processes, the analyses, and how the systems work. And so that would be something that myself and other scholars like me who have fought to have the truth of our experience and the truth of the European experience and the truth of the Asian and the Arab experience told, it does take a serious, honest scholarship. And my brother, unfortunately, has tendencies to be dishonest, and that's what has to be pointed out. He touches on important parts of the history. He touches on significant episodes, but linking, connecting the dots, and showing you the system's impact is not what is either his intention or his intent to let us have that type of understanding.
Absolutely. You have talked before about this subject and outlined a few of the histories that I saw, and we talk about this on the between the AM. We're going to cover a few of them today. Now, first off, he starts out by were Africans here before 1619, but he only deals with Juan Garrido, who comes in 1513 and is known as the first black conquistador. And he said this is the first. He says this is the first person of African descent that we know of by name. And he also talks about Esteban the Moor, who was with four African people as well. And this is 1919. But he never said that there were African people here thousands of years ago. And Dr. David Imhotep, in his book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence, documents this, as well as they came before Columbus. Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, they came before Columbus. What do you make of this? Because African people are the indigenous people of this land. So what do you make of skipping over thousands of years of an African presence in the territory today known as the United States of America?
Well, here's a fantastic book that Henry Louis Skip the Truth Gates published, and it's called The Wonders of the African World. And it has a photo of the Great Falls in Zimbabwe, and then when you open it up, it shows some of the pyramids in the Nile, but then the first written sentence in the book speaks volumes. And this is Henry Louis Skip the Truth Gates. While I have taught African literature, I am not a scholar of the history of Africa, period. Let me say it again.
Yes.
This is Henry Louis Skip the Truth Gates in a chapter, the opening chapter of his work, which says acknowledgments at the top. First sentence, while I have taught African literature, I am not a scholar of the history of Africa. And so we have to understand that this brother has been posturing. He has been in literature. He has had some significant work done in that area, but he has been given money to become the sage of the African world history, and he is not. And so, but with the money behind him, he can produce wonderful works like this book on Africa, which again does not deal with the ancient history. He visits Nubia, and there he says for the first time, that's the Sudan, for the first time he sees black pharaohs. So all of the work in Kemet is beyond his grasp. This is the person who admits that he's not a scholar, and you can understand. But why would he go through so much length to reverse the great scholarship of Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, Dr. Obanga, Dr. Clark, Dr. Ben, and all of the great female and male scholars? He has gone through great lengths to devastate their work. And so he does not want to deal with the ancient founding of the human family and the African dispersal throughout the world from that birthplace in Africa, because, again, that is history, which is the unfolding of the human experience on planet Earth. He prefers his story, the story of rich white men on planet Earth. That's his approach, and those are the people that are paying him to be the highest paid and the wealthiest black scholar ever, but it's at a price of him twisting and distorting and not fully developing the truth of our experience, which is emerging more and more. And so in spite of his great efforts not to deal with, I've never heard him mention the name Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop. I've only heard him mention the name Dr. John Henry Clark in the negative sense with an article that was published in the New York Times, which talked about pseudo-scholars and anti-Semites.
Right.
So he has a deep foundation of anti-Africanism. And so we've got to begin to understand that, in spite of the great work, some of the great work that he's done. But when he does it, it doesn't come out on it with an African perspective. It comes out with the European perspective.
Absolutely.
He talked about Jeffers. He talked about the so-called founding father, George Washington, and he talks about one of his enslaved Africans and his relationship to this whole process. But he makes no mention that all of the founding fathers, including George, had enslaved Africans. Thomas Jefferson had a complex of 4 plantations, Monticello being the center of the piece. He had 500 to 600 enslaved Africans. And you can't talk about African-American lives without mentioning that this nation was founded not in freedom, justice, and equality, but it was founded in injustice, inequality, and the centerpiece of it was enslavement. They were not fighting just to be free from the British. They were fighting to get free from the British to run their own slave operation. Instead of being part of the British colonial African slave system, they wanted to spin off their own operation. And that's why the whole nation was set up favoring white men with slaves. There was a weighted vote. There was a weighted process in the Constitution that gave people who had enslaved Africans more power than anybody else. So to talk about all men are created equal is one of the ideals that they projected, but the reality was the nation was set up with a weighted vote for the slavers. And that's why when we talk about the Electoral College, it was set up to give that weighted vote to the enslavers, those Washingtons, Jefferson, Monroes, and Madisons. Even Benjamin Franklin, who's considered one of the most liberal of them, had a male servant enslaved, and he had Africans enslaved working his printing establishment. So we need to know the history. We don't need to know episodes which reflect a titillating interest around historical events. We need to know our system, because that system reworks itself. It's still reworking itself today. So we went from chattel slavery, in which we were made property of someone else, losing in the process our humanity, and we've been fighting for the restoration of that humanity ever since. And then when hundreds of thousands of our people, including your great-great-parents and mine, the significant 500,000 black folks that participated in a real way in the Civil War, then that war came to an end with our crucial participation. But then they came up with another trick in the implementation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and here you have wage slavery, peonage. We're tied down to the land. And so as we struggled to destroy that over the next 100 years from 1865, now they've come up with debt slavery. And so our sister, this great scholar, Michelle Alexander, has produced a work, The New Jim Crow, which talks about the prison system before our very eyes in your lifetime and mine over the last 30 or 40 years has now become the new enslavement. So you go from chattel slavery, where you attempted to dehumanize you, to wage slavery, where they tie you down to peonage, and then to this debt slavery, which is going worldwide, because even the wealthiest African nations are tied down with an artificial debt that was created by the European system, and now they'll never be able to get themselves truly free unless that debt is canceled, because they are not in a position to pay the interest on the debt. So we need a systems analysis now to give a better understanding of what has happened and what is happening and what needs to happen in terms of our efforts, so we can stop this process of domination, destruction, and death.
Absolutely. If you're just tuning in, you listen to the African History Network show. Our guest for this segment is Dr. Leonard Jeffries. We're talking about the documentary, The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, that's airing on PBS in 6 parts. It's by Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. We're dealing with some of the historical inaccuracies in this documentary. There are some good things in here, but there's some gross historical inaccuracies, especially in episode 1. If you have a question, give us a call, 1375 914 838 1375. Press the number 1 key to put you in queue. Listen to the phone, don't listen to the computer, because there's a delay and it will throw you off. Write down your questions or comments. Keep them brief. We'll try to get through as many as we can. We'll go into the phone lines in just a minute here. All right, now, also Dr. Jeffries, he talked about let's see, he said that slaves were captured as prisoners of war. He said historians estimate that the majority of Africans captured and sold into slavery were sold by African kingdoms. He did, however, go on to say that Africans did not practice a slavery where you were enslaved for generations or perpetuity. He said that was a European creation. And that's how the history of the role of trade benefited from it. Talk about I read an article where he talked about how 9%. He said historians. This is what he said. He said historians estimate that 90% of the Africans captured and sold during the transatlantic slave trade were captured and sold by other Africans. Let's talk about this. Is that historically accurate or what?
No one. That's a guesstimate. Mm-hmm. No one has the information on that. That's a guesstimate by some of the historians, just as the historians have had guesstimates over how many Africans were taken out of Africa. Mm-hmm. Dr. Philip Curtin, a white historian, has said that his records show that between 9 and 10 million were taken out. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who did his Ph.D. on the suppression of the slave trade, the first publication of a Harvard historical series, when he got his Ph.D. at Harvard, he did a study of the suppression of the slave trade. His historical analysis said that anywhere between 70 and 90 million were taken out. So here you have a white historian saying he has documentation that says 10 million, and our great historian, W.E.B. Du Bois, our great scholar of eminence, says there's closer to 100 million. So no one knows, because they weren't there to get the information. They're going on, and you have to ask them, are you talking about the actual enslaved Africans that were recorded on the slave ships that were all lined up along the coast of Africa, each of them attached to a European nation, each of them attached to a fort on the coast of Africa, each of them attached to factories up country that were planted there so that they could create chaos among the Africans and induce conflicts among the Africans and supply the Africans with guns and whiskey to create the chaos so that captives could be created. But all of these figures are guesstimates. For example, he does speak about Sierra Leone and the Gambia. Yes. But the Gambia ran 150 miles or more up into Africa. And the Europeans had forts at the mouth of the Gambia River. They had forts 50 miles up. That's James Fort. That's where the history of Kunta Kinte is related in terms of Jufre. They had forts up into Abreda, further up the river, another 50 miles. They had forts and factories even further up. So for them to say that the Europeans didn't penetrate the coast where it was available for penetration, they did. They planted their factories. Often they had, they even created what they called the mulatto slaving trader who lived up country. And there was a whole system over 400 years. So at what stage are you taking your facts? Are you taking it from the early stages where the Portuguese did try to penetrate and did try to create a mulatto component that helped to get involved in slavery? The mulatto component wasn't chiefs. These were people who were created to man the factories on the rivers that they could penetrate. And when you're talking about the Portuguese, you got to go the whole length of the slave system, all the way around to Fort Jesus in Mombasa, in Kenya, and they had slave forts and dungeons along the coast of southern Africa, on the west coast, Angola, and Cabinda, the Congo, and they had their establishments on the islands off of Nigeria, San Fernando, Po, and they had establishments in Nigeria, as well as, which was called the Slave Coast, all the way up to Senegal. So you can't look at the system in one particular point and make your assessments. You have to see 400 years, and Sometimes the European was able to penetrate, sometimes he didn't. And the great tragedy was it's a European system initiated by Europeans, sustained and maintained by Europeans, the profits going mainly to the Europeans, just as the international drug system is not the brothers on the corner selling junk to each other. It's an international system that goes all the way to the great banks of the world. Any bank that you know of, the Bank of America, Chase Bank, all of the French banks have been laundering drug money. It is much too large a system, and it's not a system. We don't have any Africans in Asia, in the Golden Triangle, preparing drugs. We don't have any in the jungles of South America. They are part of the system on the ground, but it's not their system. Apply that same analysis to the African situation. The Europeans went in, they tricked one African to say that we'll give you guns if you can get some captives from your neighbors. And so they start a war. And then another European nation comes down and say, well, the ones working with the British have guns. We're the French. We'll give you some guns so you can fight them. So you have to see the thing in a much deeper way than in a superficial way that he presents it. But there's no doubt, if it was for just the Africans to be involved in the system, Africans would still be standing on the shores of Africa waiting to go somewhere. Europeans had the plans, and they fitted out the ships in Europe. They set up the charter companies that were parastatals. They had the economic, political, cultural, and military powers in these charter companies. They mapped out where they wanted to go. They knew which Africans they wanted to induce. They knew what kind of wars they want to create. They knew what whiskey and this they wanted to give to the various chiefs. So even Africans involved and the chiefs or the kingdoms that were involved, there's a story on how they got involved, and it certainly didn't have to do with African slavery. It had to do with the European desire to maintain a slave system. African domination or servitude was nothing like the dehumanizing process that the European conceived of, and we have to understand that it did not begin with the Europeans enslaving Africans. One of the scholars that Skip Gates had said the Europeans had no enslavement of the Europeans. That's out and out. Somebody should have picked that up and taken that out. The term slavery comes from the term Slavs, and it's the Slavic people in Eastern Europeans, the Russians, the Czechoslovakians, the Yugoslavians, the Polish people that were enslaved by Christian West Europeans in France and Germany and Spain and Portugal and Italy. And for 400 years there was the white slave trade that took place before the transatlantic slave trade got started in the 1500s. And so you have to see European peoples who come out of a feudal system that everything is related to property, taking Eastern European Slavic peoples and selling them into Arab slavery. That's a chapter of history that's worth looking at. I wish Henry Louis Skip the Truth Gates would do a service to his European money people that pay him and do a study of white slave trade. I'd be interested in that. I'd watch that on any TV program that he put together or any books he put together. But you have to be able to see Europeans selling Europeans into the Arab world. You have to be able to see the Arab world having an Eastern African, East Indian trade system, Persian Gulf system in which they were devastating the African continent. And so we can't get sentimental, and because many of us have deep roots and current roots in Islam, of not dealing with the impact of the African, North Africa, and East Africa in terms of the slave trade in the East that complemented the transatlantic slave trade and pre-exists before, by hundreds of years, if not 500 years before the slave trade that went west. You had the slave trade going north into the east.
Absolutely. Okay, now and we talked about that before, and that's and you're talking about the feudalistic system. You're talking about feudalism from the 9th century to the 15th century, where you had Europeans enslaving other Europeans. You're talking about feudalism, right?
Yes, and
absolutely.
And it's documented. But for a scholar to say there's no evidence of Europeans selling Europeans, even the initiation of a labor for the plantations of the New World, the Indians were dying out. They did not fit the mold of the domination of it. So they attempted to bring their own peoples into a semi-slave system of servitude. So wherever you go, you got different gradations of the system. Finally, because of the strength and the resistance of the African to the devastating diseases, et cetera, the Africans became the prime persons who could deal with the tropics, and so they became the target of the slave system. But Europeans were involved in the slave system with Europeans in America, not going back to the hundreds of years before in the so-called feudal period. That our brother has a chapter, Lerone Bennett, which is called White Servitude. The first chapter is the first generations. That's when he talked about Anthony Johnson and others that first came, demanded their freedom, and they got it, and they created a free black community. The same thing, that was Virginia. The same thing happened in terms of the Dutch, and a few years after the Dutch man of war brought Africans into Virginia, and the Dutch set up New York in 1623, 1625. They brought in Africans to knock down the forest and work it. And those Africans, after a couple of decades in the 1640s, petitioned for their freedom, just as they did in Virginia, and they got freedom. So the first Africans to come into the Americas and North America as enslaved Africans eventually demanded their freedom and got it in Dutch New York and in Virginia. That's a story to be told. But not to mention Anthony Johnson, and to say he had slaves too. He had whites in servitude, and he did have an African in servitude, because the colony was moving servitude into permanent slavery for black folks. That's the next chapter of Lerone Bennett, The Road Not Taken. They had a chance to remove slavery from everybody, but they removed it from servitude from white folks and put blacks in lifetime enslavement. So the African that Anthony Johnson had on his plantation was enslaved by Virginia laws and customs. And then this black man took Johnson to court and got his freedom. So it's an interesting history, but not the way Henry Louis Gates lays it out. He wants to say black folks had slaves, black folks were, and he will not put the system, understand that this is a system conceived by Europeans, maintained by Europeans, sustained by the Europeans, and the Europeans fought war after war to maintain this system. So if you want to talk about kings involved in the system, put the King of England, put the Queen of England, Elizabeth I, in 1560. She had her sea dogs ripping off the Spanish galleons, because the Spanish and the Portuguese were the first to get into the slaving system. So the English, the Northerners, the Protestants, they wanted a piece of the action. So they fought war after war on who's going to control the system. You can't even understand or begin to understand the so-called Black Atlantic or the European-American Atlantic without understanding the system.
Absolutely. We're going to the phone lines in just a second. We're going to the 302, the 850, the 313, the 704. So we're coming to you in just a minute. I encourage people to read the article from Dr. Malefikete Asante, published May 6, 2010. Henry Louis Gates is wrong about African involvement in the slave trade. You can Google that article. Henry Louis Gates is wrong about African involvement in the slave trade. You can also go to asante.net, ASANTE.net, which is Dr. Malefikete Asante's website. The article is there. But the passage from it, he says about blame for the slave trade. He said Gates' attempt equally with Europeans in the enslaving of Africans in order to argue in his narrative superstructure that it is difficult who should pay reparations, because Dr. Gates is an apologist for Europeans, and he's trying to put forth this information to mitigate the legitimacy of a claim of people of African descent for reparations from Europeans. Okay, and if you look at the documentary Rivers to Cross, the African Americans, it's heavily financed by Bank of America. Dr. Asante goes on to say, it is not difficult at all. One only has to ask the questions. Who traveled to Africa in search of captives? Who created an entire industry of shipbuilding, insurance, outfitting crews and ships, and base? Who benefited enormously from the evil and the vile project of human kidnapping? What countries held the asiento from the Catholic Church and the King of Spain for regions of Africa used exclusively for capturing Africans? And the asiento was a legal agreement that Spain had with other countries, that these other countries could sell slaves to Spain and Spanish territory. Okay, so check out that article, because this clears up a whole lot of nonsense. Henry Louis Gates is wrong about African involvement in the slave trade. Go ahead, brother.
And I think I'm glad you raised the question of the asiento, A-S-I-N-T-O. That was the contract that the King of Spain made with other nations to bring captive Africans into the Spanish New World. And it was blessed by the Vatican, the Roman Church. In fact, the Roman Church, after the so-called discovery by Columbus in 1492, in 1493, the Roman Church got involved in who controls what, Spain or Portugal, and they decided to divide the world with a papal bull. And that papal bull divided from the North Pole to the South Pole, the world between Spain and Portugal. And so shortly thereafter, in the 1500s, 1516, the Catholic Church got involved again in terms of the asiento, the agreement, a contract to bring Africans to the Spanish New World. So until you can see the system impact and understand the system relationship, you can't have the real deep understanding, and that's what we have to strive for. Every system has three components, and we need to look at life in terms of systems. And the three components are economics, your productive, creative capability. And that productive, creative capability can be meaningful if you have politics. Politics is not just what politicians do. Politics is what you do to control your life and to control your economics. So politics provides what we call the managerial or administrative capability to go along with the creative capability. And then the third factor is culture. Culture tells you what type of economics to develop and who to do your politics with. So when you put those three things and connect them, economics, politics, and culture, you can have a better understanding of what the asiento represented, what the Pope's involvement, dividing up the world, giving half to Spain and half to Portugal, what that represented, and what the Protestant Reformation, which was born at the same time as the asiento. The Protestant Reformation is credited with Martin Luther. That's 1517. So the year after the asiento, the contract which involved the Catholic nations and the Catholic Pope, the Protestant world emerges with Martin Luther, and that Protestant world breaks from the Catholic Church. And then they began to see not the blessings of Protestantism, but the profits of enslavement. So for the next couple of hundred years, the Protestant world and the Catholic world are at war over who is going to control this new international system of domination, destruction, and death.
Absolutely. Okay, let's go to the phone lines. Let's go to the 302. Call in 2. Tell us your name, where you're calling from. Call in 302 area code. Are you there? Are you just listening, or you have a question or comment? Okay, they're just listening. Let's go to the 850. Call in the 850. Hold on, we just lost the 850. Call in 313. Tell us your name, where you're calling from.
Hello, this is Rodney. I'm calling from Detroit, Michigan.
Hey, in Detroit. How you doing, brother?
I'm good. My question was, are you familiar with the details of the slaves who overthrew Cuba and gained independence? Like what advantage did they have that Nat Turner didn't, or something?
Okay, did you hear that question, brother, Dr. Jeffries?
I think he was saying that, did I have any knowledge of enslaved Africans who overthrew or who revolted in Cuba?
Yeah.
And that was before or Nat Turner?
Yeah. What type of advantage did they have that Nat Turner did not have?
Well, that's a good question. Wherever Africans were involved in enslavement, there were revolts. There were runaways up into the mountains, or there were people that killed themselves. And so the advantage that Cuba had and Haiti is that they were dealing with sugar cane plantations. The enslavement of the islands in the Caribbean and in Brazil and Cuba was heavy sugar cane plantations, which meant that you had to have a lot of 500 or maybe 1,000 people working the fields, cutting the cane and doing the processing, etc. So you had a strategic mass of Africans who, if they moved together, they would be successful in their revolts. And so in the Caribbean and Latin America, you do have series of successful, semi-successful revolts. In America, you had a white-dominated environment where you didn't have a plantation of 500 to 1,000. You might have had a plantation of 20. So you had 5 or 6 white folks, including the owners and the overseers and the people watching the enslaved persons, and maybe 10 or 20 or 30 people. You did not have these massive industrialized factories that represented the plantations in the islands and also in Cuba. And because of that concentration, in Haiti was able to produce the most sustained successful revolt because you had such large numbers of people on the sugarcane plantation. And the same phenomenon happened in Brazil, where the Africans in the 1600s were able to leave the cane plantations and revolt and go up into the hills, into what they call palmadas, and for almost 1,000 years had a free republic, a free community in the mountain ranges, tens of thousands of Africans living free. And it took the armies of the Portuguese and the Dutch and some unscrupulous attacks to destroy it. For 100 years, the first free nation in the Americas was Palmares in Brazil, and it existed between 1600 and 1700. That's before there's an American nation, before there is any of the other so-called independent nations that occurred.
Okay, excellent. Okay, Ronnie, thanks for your question, brother, okay?
Thanks. Yep.
Okay, have a good night. Thanks for the question. Okay. And you know, we'll go to the 704 in just a minute, and the 610, and we see the 85. We'll go to the 85 next because the 850 dropped down. They dropped out or something. I think he may have had to call back. Okay. Also, brother, quick question. Oh no, another comment is that in the documentary in episode 1, Gates talks about the Haitian Revolution, but he does not mention Toussaint Louverture, does not mention Boukman Dada, does not mention Dessalines. But he talks about the Haitian Revolution. What did you make of that? I found that extremely odd.
Well, no, not from his perspective, because he's writing the history to please white folks. He's writing history, and he's well paid to do it. So it is not surprising that he would not mention and make a comparison, as I do, between the 3 revolutions of that period. The American Revolution in 1776, the French Revolution in 1789, and the Haitian Revolution in 1791. And the only one that was a true revolution was the Haitian Revolution. It was the dehumanized African population rising up to establish their humanity. And the American Revolution, you had musical chairs. The plantation owners of England were challenged by the plantation owners of America, and they wanted to have an independent slaving operation. That's not a revolution. That's a change of the musical chairs on who's going to control the economic system of slavery. In France, they had a real revolution. the masses of revolted. They burned down the Bastille, which was the prison of the time. And then they established a free society of citizens, and they ended slavery. But then Napoleon came back in the picture and overthrew the freedom that had been established by the French Revolution, and then he had to go to Haiti to try to reestablish slavery, and he got his ass kicked, just as the French colons, who did not respect the first French revolutionary efforts to end slavery, and then the Haitian revolutionaries took down the French colons and defeated them. Then the British wanted to get in to help save the French slave plantation. They defeated the British. The Spanish did not operate correct, and the Haitians defeated the Spanish. And then when Napoleon brought his army from Egypt, where he had been successful militarily in 1799, and he came back to France to remove the revolutionary tradition and reestablish a dictatorship and slavery. But then he had to bring his army across the ocean, headed by his brother-in-law, to take down the Haitians, and they took him down. That Haitian revolutionary story is the real story of a revolution, a real story of people who were oppressed taking control of their world, a real story of them having the spiritual understanding, the consciousness of what they were doing, and a real story of them deciding to establish a free republic. But they were the only free republic. There was no other free republic. And so there was no system for them to become involved in. So they had to try to make a relationship to the existing systems that come out of the English world, the French world, the American world, and they all agreed to destroy the Haitian Revolution and impose reparations called indemnities on the Haitian Revolution. And the Haitian Revolution, the real revolution, never got off the ground. But that spirit still exists, and while it was strong, it helped to spur the revolutions that took place in South America and other parts of the world. So, and they inspired the revolts that took place in America. The Prosser Rebellion in 1800 was an attempt to get to Gabriel Prosser, to get his people from Virginia down to Haiti. And the revolution by Denmark Vesey in 1821, the Haitian Revolution was an inspiration for that. So we need to see the connections of real revolutions versus revolutionary activities to control a system of exploitation. And that's what the American Revolution so-called was, and that's what the French Revolution became, especially when Napoleon came in to throw out the revolutionary ideas and to reestablish enslavement.
Okay, let's go quickly to the 850. Calling from.
Hotep, Dr. Jeffries, Brother Imhotep. This is James in Virginia.
Yes,
hey,
Hotep.
James.
Okay.
How you doing?
All right. Seeing as you're, focusing on episode 1 of, Many Rivers to Cross, from that opening 5 minutes and when he was mentioning the first, African American to, set foot in the land, I pretty much laughed at for 5 minutes after hearing that.
Right.
For the gross inaccuracies of that. But going to your last point in reference to the Haitian Revolution and how, Henry Louis Skip the Truth Gates doesn't point off, or point out, Dessalines and, St. Louverture and Bookman, it kind of goes consistent with this whole series on not being able to focus on these people that actually, did something as far as like an actual revolution or, would give a sense of pride to our people. It's like he wants to block that out, like it's not that important, or he doesn't want, people to find out about it. But like you said, when the documentary is funded by Bank of America and Coca-Cola and that type of stuff, then you know what they're trying to do.
Well, and also the first funding source that they put up there was Senegal. So I just finished talking with one of my Senegalese partners, and I'm going to talk to him tomorrow and find out to what extent did Senegal put their monies into it, and what extent did they have some control over the product. And you're right. You're absolutely right. Even in the last episode, which we looked at the other night, he decides which part of the history he's going to deal with, and Emmett Till and those stirring things of the 50s are not there. And even the Supreme Court decision, Thurgood Marshall, and its implication is not there. And then in the 60s, he's talking Black Power with Kwame Ture, but Black Power with Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture also was complemented not only by the student movement in the South, but in the North. You had Adam Clayton Powell. In the 50s, he became one of the leading African-American congressional leaders, and he went to Bandung to be with the revolutionary activities that were going on in Asia with China and Indonesia and other places. And then in the 60s, he was having Black Power conferences. Whilst Kwame Ture and others were talking about Black Power down south, I was there coming back and forth from Africa in 66. In 67, they had a Black Power conference in my hometown in Newark, New Jersey, 67. They had it in Newark, 68. They had it in Philadelphia. And so there was movement going on, but there's no mention of these black political figures. There's no mention of the explosion in Harlem in 64, the explosion in Watts in 65, the explosion that went to the Black Power Conference in Newark, and eventually we left the Black Power Conference ready to go to Detroit because Detroit was exploding. None of these urban explosions are part of the mix in his presentation. It's a personal thing around statements by Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, and not the real flow that was going on. And at the same time, there was a heavy activity, Black Power in Africa. That's when the African nations in the early 60s, I was there back and forth when the independence was emerging out of the French, out of the English, Ghana and Nigeria, out of East Africa in 62 and 63, out of the West Indies nations in 62 and 63. And so none of that is captured by the brother. It's these individual episodes and not the movement of a global people trying to reestablish their humanity.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, that too. And the lack of mentioning of Brother Malcolm X, too, was also included in that last episode that I saw, too. So,
yes.
I was really, really, bothered by that. But thanks for
he has the genius of the brother is that he gets money to go in and get this new footage and this wonderful footage. So you're watching our people doing things. But the 60s was an explosion. The 50s was an explosion. And none of that is captured. To see that city after city, black people are saying no, and they're ready to burn down the cities. And that's why after the Watts Rebellion, the McCune Report, people should study that. They said that the dynamite in the urban areas in America was the black youth between 15 and 25 that didn't have a serious future and other things in their grasp, and they would be the fuel to devastate the urban areas. So a plan to devastate that age group was put in place from the McCune Report, and I think McCune was the head of the CIA or something of that nature. We need to study that. But there's a serious attempt to suck black folks into the jail system, to suck them into the Vietnam War, to cream off a group of the blacks and send them into the white colleges to integrate. There was an attempt to target black youth between 15 and 25 in this particular period because there was too much going on in our world.
Absolutely. Okay, James, thanks for calling in, brother, okay?
All right.
Okay, thanks. Peace. Okay, let's go to the, we'll go to the 469 area code quickly.